The sky turned the color of old bruises. In minutes, the wind began to scream through the pine trees like a wounded animal, and the temperature dropped so fast Margaret could feel it in her bones. It was then she understood the blizzard was coming, and it would be merciless. With her 7 children, the widow ran toward the only shelter visible through the whiteout, the abandoned Thornhill Mansion. Perched on the ridge like a tombstone, everyone in the valley swore it was cursed. The doors groaned as she forced them open, snow already piling against her back. But inside, behind a steel door sealed for decades in the basement, she found something that made no sense being there. Something intact, untouched, as if it had been waiting for her all along. And now, tell me, what city are you watching this story from? I want to know how far this will reach. The January sun hung low and weak over the Alaskan interior when Margaret stopped splitting firewood, sensing that something in the fabric of the world had broken without making a sound. It was 1952, and the cold rose from the frozen ground like an invisible vapor that distorted the horizon, making the scraggly spruce trees and the rusted tin roofs of their small settlement dance in her vision. Margaret, barely 34 years old, but with deep lines carved around her eyes and hands calloused from firewood and laundry, wiped the frost from her brow with the back of her wrist and looked toward the mountains. It wasn't the usual view of snow-covered peaks standing silent and majestic against the pale sky. There was an unnatural stillness, a kind of paralysis in the air that had silenced even the ravens that usually fought over scraps near the woodpile. Her instinct, sharpened by recent widowhood and the necessity of protecting 7 children, screamed that this silence wasn't peace. It was the deep breath of a beast for the attack. It had been barely 8 months since the avalanche. 8 months since that white monster came roaring down the mountain without warning and swallowed Thomas whole, leaving Margaret adrift in a world of men where a woman alone was worth less than a broken sled. The memory still woke her at night. Thomas's face, shocked and terrified, disappearing into the churning white death, his hand reaching for her, his mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear over the thunder of 10,000 tons of snow. They lived crammed in a timber shack now, a fragile structure that shuddered with every gust of wind, where nights were long and food was always scarce. 7 mouths to feed on a widow's pittance, from little Samuel, just 2 years old, who still clung to her skirt seeking comfort and didn't understand why Daddy never came home, to Rose, the eldest at 14, who already carried the tiny, knowing gaze of adults who'd seen too much too soon. Margaret had no time for grief. Grief was a luxury for people who had the resources to fall apart. Her life had become a brutal succession of survival strategies, mending clothes for other families at 2 cents a garment, cleaning fish at the cannery for a few coins that smelled like death, chopping firewood until her hands bled, and praying, always praying, that the trap lines Thomas had set before he died would bring something more than frozen rabbits with more bones than meat. But that morning something was different. The air tasted metallic, like licking iron nails. The wind, which had been merely cold, suddenly turned vicious, cutting through her wool coat as if it weren't there at all. Margaret had lived in Alaska long enough to read the signs written in the sky and the behavior of animals. The sky wasn't just gray, it was green-tinged at the edges, a sickly color that meant the temperature was about to plummet to depths that could kill an unprepared person in minutes. She looked at the thermometer nailed to the outside of their cabin, the one Thomas had installed their first winter together, 20 below zero, and she could see the red line dropping as she watched, the mercury retreating down the glass tube like it was trying to hide from what was coming. The first snowflakes began to fall, but these weren't the gentle flakes of a normal winter day that drifted down like feather. These were hard, sharp crystals driven horizontal by winds that were already reaching 30, 40 miles per hour and climbing. Within minutes, literally minutes, the world began to disappear behind a wall of white so thick and violent that Margaret couldn't see the woodshed 20 feet away. Her neighbor, old Henrik, appeared like a ghost through the blowing snow, his weathered face wrapped in furs until only his ice-crusted eyes were visible. "Margaret," he shouted over the wind, his voice barely audible, even though he was right next to her. "This is bad. Worst I've seen in 40 years. Get your kids and get to higher ground. The valley's gonna be a death trap." "Where?" Margaret shouted back, her heart already racing with a mother's instinctive terror. Their cabin was in a low spot, sheltered from normal winds but dangerously vulnerable to the massive drifts that could bury a building completely in hours during a true blizzard. She'd seen it happen to the Johnsons 3 winters ago. They'd found the family in spring, frozen solid in their beds, the cabin buried under 15 feet of snow. Henrik pointed up the ridge with a mittened hand toward the dark shape barely visible through the storm. "Thornhill Place. Only stone building for 20 miles. It'll hold. Get moving now, woman, or you'll all be dead by morning." Margaret's blood ran cold at the name, colder even than the wind that was now tearing at her clothes with invisible claws. The Thornhill Mansion. Everyone knew it. Everyone avoided it. Everyone told stories about it that made children hide under their blankets. The massive stone manor had been built 30 years ago by Clayton Thornhill, the man who'd owned the Golden Promise mine before it played out and left half the valley unemployed and bitter. They said he'd gone mad up there after the gold ran dry and his creditors came calling. Said he'd locked himself inside with his fortune and refused to come out, convinced that everyone was trying to rob him. Said he died alone in in that vast, cold house, and that his ghost still walked the halls, counting his gold and cursing the world that had abandoned him. Parents used the Thornhill Mansion to frighten children into behavior. Be good, or Old Man Thornhill's ghost will come for you in the night. Don't wander too far, or you'll end up at the cursed house and never come back. No one went near it. Hunters gave it a wide berth. Trappers who tried to shelter there during storms swore they heard voices in the wall, footsteps in empty rooms, the sound of someone weeping in the basement. But looking at her 7 children huddled inside their shack, watching the walls already beginning to groan and flex under the wind's terrible pressure, Margaret knew she had no choice. Ghosts didn't freeze people to death. Blizzards did. Ghosts were just stories. The storm was real, and it was going to kill them if they stayed here. Kids, get your coats on. Now, we're leaving. Her voice cut through their fear like a knife through snow. She'd learned since Thomas died that hesitation killed. That in a crisis, decisiveness, even when you were terrified, even when you didn't know if you were making the right choice, kept people alive. Paralysis was death. Action was survival. Rose, understanding immediately with the terrible wisdom of a girl who'd become a woman too soon, began helping the younger ones into their lair. Margaret grabbed Samuel and Lucy, the 2 youngest, wrapping them in every blanket she could find, every scrap of wool and fur in their meager supply. The temperature was still dropping. She could feel it in her lungs, the way each breath hurt going in and came out as white fog. This wasn't just a bad storm. This was the kind of cold that turned exposed skin black in minutes, that made your lungs hurt with every breath, that killed strong men who made a single mistake. This was a killer storm, the kind that old-timers talked about with fear in their voices, the kind that came once every 20 years and changed the landscape, buried entire camps, and was still finding bodies when spring came. They stepped outside into hell made of ice and wind. The wind hit them like a physical blow, nearly knocking Margaret off her feet despite her bracing for it. Snow was already knee-deep and getting deeper by the minute. Visibility was down to arm's length. The world had become a screaming white void where direction ceased to exist, where up and down lost meaning, where you could walk in circles 3 feet from safety and freeze to death never knowing help was close. Hold hands, don't let go. Stay together, Margaret shouted, but the wind ripped her words away before they could reach her children's ears. She could see their mouths moving, see them crying, but couldn't hear a sound except the demonic shriek of the wind. She tied a rope around her own waist with fingers that were already going numb, then around Rose, then through all 7 children, creating a human chain. If they got separated in this whiteout, they were dead. Simple as that. They'd wander blind until exhaustion took them, sit down to rest, and never get up again. The climb toward the ridge was a nightmare born of ice and terror. Every step was a battle against wind that felt like it wanted to peel the skin from their faces, to push them back down the slope, to punish them for daring to resist its power. The children cried, but Margaret couldn't hear them over the roar of the storm. Samuel was already going limp in her arms, his little body unable to generate enough heat to keep fighting. She held him tighter, tucking him inside her coat, using her own body heat to shield him from the killing cold. Halfway up, 6-year-old Peter fell, his legs giving out from exhaustion and cold. The rope jerked tight, nearly pulling them all down in a tumble that would have sent them rolling back to the valley floor. Rose, showing strength Margaret didn't know she possessed, grabbed her brother and hauled him up by sheer force of will, screaming something Margaret couldn't hear but understood in her bones. Keep moving or we all die. The mansion appeared through the white like a dark ship emerging from fog, its stone wall black against the snow, its empty windows like eye sockets in a skull. Massive 3 stories of stone and timber, with Gothic windows and a slate roof that had somehow survived decades of neglect. In any other circumstance, it would have been terrifying. Now it was salvation. Now it was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever seen. She hit the front door with her shoulder. Once, twice. The lock was frozen solid, the wood swollen with decades of moisture and ice. She looked around desperately, her vision starting to blur from the snow caking her eyelashes, and spotted a fallen branch half buried in a drift, thick as her arm and solid as iron. Using it as a battering ram, she struck the door near the handle with every ounce of strength she had left, with all the desperate fury of a mother fighting for her children's lives. The wood around the lock splintered on the first hit, cracked on the second. On the third hit, something inside gave way with a sound like breaking bones, and the door crashed inward. They tumbled into darkness and cold that was somehow, miraculously, less lethal than the cold outside. Margaret slammed the door shut behind them, cutting off the wind's scream, and in the sudden relative quiet, she could hear her children sobbing, their teeth chattering so violently it sounded like bones breaking. They were inside. They were alive. But as Margaret looked around at the vast, dark entrance hall, with its grand staircase disappearing into shadow and its furniture covered in dusty sheets like corpses, she couldn't shake one thought. They'd escaped one death, but what had they walked into? Margaret slammed the door shut behind them with all her remaining strength, using her body weight to force it closed against the wind that clawed at it like a living thing trying to get inside. The sudden absence of the wind's demonic shriek was so profound it felt like going deaf. Her ears rang in the silence. Then gradually other sounds emerged. Her children's ragged breathing, their chattering teeth, the creak and groan of the old mansion settling around them, and somewhere deep in the building, a sound like wind moving through empty rooms, though that was impossible with all the doors and windows sealed. In the sudden relative quiet, Margaret could finally assess the damage. All 7 children were showing signs of hypothermia, confusion in their eyes, exhaustion pulling at their small bodies, the dangerous sleepiness that preceded death. Samuel's lips were blue, almost purple. Rose's hands were white and waxy, the fingers swollen. Peter was shaking so violently he couldn't stand, and little Lucy just stared at nothing, her eyes unfocused and glassy. "We need fire, right now." Margaret's voice came out as a croak, her throat raw from breathing frozen air and screaming orders that the wind had swallowed. Her mind raced through the options, fighting against her own exhaustion cold. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, but it was built by a rich man, a man who had valued comfort and display. There would be fireplaces, multiple fireplaces, and maybe if God showed any mercy at all, there would be wood. The entrance hall was enormous and decaying, a testament to wealth that had rotted from the inside out. A curved staircase with an ornate banister led up into darkness, its red carpet runner faded and moth-eaten. Furniture covered in dusty sheets loomed like ghosts in the dim light that filtered through the snow-covered window. Portraits hung on the walls, their subjects' faces obscured by grime and shadow. The air smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, something sweet and cloying that Margaret couldn't identify. But her eyes locked on the massive fireplace dominating the far wall. It was made of river stone with a mantle carved from a single massive timber, big enough to roast a whole deer. And beside it, Margaret's heart leaped, was a stack of fire, very old, covered in dust and cobweb, but wood nonetheless. Dry wood that had been sitting inside for decades. She stumbled toward it on legs that felt like wooden posts, carrying Samuel, who was now completely limp in her arms. "Rose, help me get everyone to the fireplace. Move them close." Rose, God bless her, understood immediately. Despite her own exhaustion and confusion, she began herding her siblings toward the fireplace like a young sheepdog, pushing and pulling the smaller ones who could barely walk. They collapsed in a heap on the dusty floor in front of the cold hearth, a pile of shivering children who looked more dead than alive. Margaret's hands shook violently as she pulled out the waterproof match case she always carried, Thomas's last gift to her before the avalanche. It was a small brass cylinder that screwed shut, designed for trappers and prospectors who needed to keep their fire-starting materials dry no matter what. Thomas had given it to her on their last morning together, pressing it into her hands with a kiss. "Keep this close," he'd said. "Fire is life up here." If he'd known how prophetic those words would be, would he have said something different? Would he have held her longer, kissed her deeper, told her things she needed to hear? Margaret pushed the thoughts away. Grief was a luxury. Survival was all that mattered. Inside the case were 12 matches, a striker pad, and a small amount of tinder. 12 chances to start a fire. 12 chances to save her children's lives. She examined the wood stack carefully by the faint light from the window. Most of it was solid, dry, split kindling, and logs that would burn well once lit. But she needed something that would catch quickly, that would go from spark to flame in seconds, because her children didn't have minutes to spare. Margaret looked around desperately. The furniture, the sheets covering the furniture. They were old cotton, probably dry as bone, and cotton burned fast and hot. She grabbed the corner of the nearest dust cover and yanked. The sheet came away in a cloud of dust that made her cough, revealing a fainting couch upholstered in faded velvet. Margaret tore strips from the sheet with her teeth. Her fingers were too numb to grip properly, and crumpled them into the fireplace. Then she layered on the smallest pieces of kindling, building a careful structure that would allow air to flow and feed the flames once they started. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the match case. She had to try 3 times to unscrew the lid, and when it finally came free, she nearly dropped the whole thing. One match fell out and disappeared into the dust on the floor. 11 chances now. Margaret positioned herself to block any drafts, scraped the match head against the striker, and held her breath. Nothing. The match head crumbled without sparking. The cold had gotten to it despite the waterproof case. 10 chances. She tried another. This one sparked but went out immediately, the flame dying before it could catch the matchstick. 9 chances. "Please," Margaret whispered. "Please, God, Thomas. Whoever's listening, please." The third match caught. A small, brave flame flickered at the end of the stick, dancing in the still air of the mansion. Margaret cupped her hand around it, protecting it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which in that moment it absolutely was. She touched it to the crumpled cloth, holding it there, willing the fabric to catch. For a terrible second, nothing happened. The flame touched the cloth and seemed about to die. Then, with a soft whoomp, the cotton caught fire. Orange flame spread across the fabric like a living thing waking up hungry, eating the old cloth, growing stronger, reaching for the kindling above. The small sticks began to smoke, then char, then burst into flame with a crackling sound that was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever heard. She fed the fire carefully, adding larger pieces as the smaller ones caught, building it gradually so as not to smother it. Smoke began to rise up the chimney. Thank God the chimney wasn't blocked. And within minutes, actual heat began to radiate from the growing blaze. "Come closer, babies. Get warm." Margaret gathered her children around the fire like a hen gathering chicks, pulling them into the circle of heat that was slowly, painfully slowly, beginning to push back the killing cold. For the first 15 minutes, she just focused on keeping them awake and moving. anything. She made them wiggle their fingers and toes, rub their hands together, shift their position. Falling asleep now could still be fatal. Hypothermia could kill hours after you got warm if your core temperature had dropped too far. Samuel was the worst. He wasn't responding, just lying limp against her chest. Margaret opened her coat and pulled him inside, skin to skin, using her body heat to warm him direct. His skin felt like ice against hers. She rubbed his back, his arms, his leg, trying to get blood flowing to his extremity. Come on, baby. Come on. Stay with mama. Stay with me. Gradually, so gradually, she almost didn't notice at first. Color began to return to their faces. The violent shivering that signaled hypothermia started to ease. Samuel made a small sound and stirred against her. Peter stopped, staring at nothing, and started crying, which was actually a good sign because it meant his body had energy to spare for emotions again. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Through the tall windows of the entrance hall, Margaret could see nothing but white chaos. Snow being driven sideways by winds that had to be 60, 70 miles per hour by now. The mansion groaned and creaked under the assault, but the stone walls held. Windows rattled in their frames but didn't break. This place had been built to last, built by a man who spared no expense. They were trapped here. This would be their shelter for however long the blizzard lasted. Could be a day, could be 3 days, could be a week. Margaret had lived through enough Alaskan winters to know that storms like this didn't end quickly. As the immediate crisis of freezing to death passed, new problems emerged. They had no food. Margaret had grabbed them and run with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the blankets they'd been wrapped in. No supplies, no provisions, nothing, and water. They'd need water. She could melt snow. There was certainly enough of it outside, but she'd need something to melt it in and something to drink from. But those were problems for later. Right now, the children were finally warming enough to stop shaking, finally safe enough to close their eyes without it being a death sentence. As exhaustion overtook them one by one, they collapsed into sleep right there on the floor by the fire, huddled together like puppies in a pile of salvaged blankets and discarded sheets. Margaret sat watching the fire, listening to the storm try to kill them through 3 feet of stone wall. This place had saved them. The cursed mansion, the haunted house, the place everyone avoided. It had opened its doors and taken them in and kept them alive when the outside world had become incompatible with human life. But as her eyes adjusted to the dancing firelight and she really looked at the grand, rotting interior of Thornhill Mansion for the first time, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that somewhere in the darkness of the upper floor, in the shadows beyond the fire's reach, something was aware of their presence. Something was watching. Something was waiting. She pushed the thought away. Survival first, superstition later. There were no such things as ghosts. There were only the living and the dead, and she intended for her family to stay firmly in the first category. But she couldn't help noticing certain things that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Some of the furniture, though covered in dust, looked like it had been recently disturbed, the dust pattern broken by handprints or brush marks. There were tracks in the dust on the floor leading toward a door beneath the main staircase. Not animal tracks, human boot prints, recent enough that they hadn't been filled in by the dust that seemed to drift constantly through the air. And there was something else, a smell beneath the dominant odors of dust and mildew, the smell of tobacco smoke. Not old, stale smoke from decades past, but recent smoke. Someone had been smoking a pipe or cigarette in this house within the last few days. Someone or something had been here recently, and Margaret had a sinking feeling that before this storm was over, she would find out what or who. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing up the walls and across the ceiling, making the portraits on the walls seem to move and watch. Margaret pulled her children closer and added another log to the fire, trying not to think about the fact that they had no food, no water, and no idea when or if this nightmare would end. She allowed herself one moment of weakness, one moment to close her eyes and whisper a prayer. Thomas, if you're out there somewhere, if you can hear me, help us. Protect your children. Show me what to do. The wind answered with a howl that sounded almost like words, almost like a voice calling from far away. The fire flickered, casting wild shadows, and somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a door creaked open, then slowly closed again. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her hand instinctively reaching for the fireplace poker. She sat up straight, listening, every muscle tense. Nothing. Just the storm, just the house settling, just her imagination playing tricks in the dancing fire. But she didn't believe that. Not really. They weren't alone in Thornhill Mansion, and whoever or whatever shared this space with them had just announced their presence. The first night in Thornhill Mansion stretched into an eternity of firelight and shadows, punctuated by the relentless howling of the wind that seemed determined to remind them that death waited just outside the stone walls. Margaret didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every creak of the old house, every groan of timber settling, every whisper of wind through cracks she couldn't see made her grip the fireplace poker tighter and scan the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Rose stirred beside her around what Margaret guessed was 3 in the morning. Though time had become strange and fluid in this place where no clocks ticked and no light came through the snow-buried windows to mark the passage of hours. At 14, Rose was old enough to understand how precarious their situation truly was, old enough to see past her mother's brave face to the terror underneath. "Mom," she whispered, her voice hoarse from breathing smoke and a cold cold air. How long do you think the storm will Margaret looked at the window, where snow had completely covered the glass, creating an eerie, luminescent wall that seemed to pulse with each gust of wind. The blizzard's voice had evolved over the hours from a shriek to a roar to something that sounded almost like words. Angry, unintelligible words shouted by a giant made of ice and rage. I don't know, honey. Storms like this, the big ones, they can last 3 days, sometimes 5. We'll know when it's over because we'll be able to see out the windows again. We don't have food. Rose's voice was small, frightened in a way that made Margaret's heart clench. Her daughter was trying so hard to be brave, to be grown up, but she was still just a child who'd lost her father 8 months ago and now faced the prospect of slowly starving in a haunted mansion while a killer storm tried to bury them alive. I know. Samuel needs to eat. He's too little to go without. He was already so weak before. I know. Margaret's voice cracked despite her best efforts to stay strong. She knew. God in heaven, she knew. The baby had been eating less and less over the past weeks as their supplies dwindled. His ribs were starting to show through his skin. His eyes had that hollow, haunted look that came from chronic hunger. Before the storm, she'd been stretching their food so thin that the children were going to bed with empty stomachs every night, and she'd been going to bed without eating at all, telling them she'd eaten already, lying with a smile while her own stomach cramped with hunger. Now they had nothing, not a scrap of food, not a crumb. There has to be something in this house, Margaret said, more to herself than to Rose. A man lived here for years. He had to have had food, supplies, something. But Mom, everyone says he died here. Died and wasn't found for 2 years. Wouldn't someone have taken anything valuable when they found the body? Margaret had thought about that. The story was that prospectors had broken into the mansion in 1930, looking for anything worth salvaging, and found Thornhill's corpse in the basement, mummified by the dry cold. They'd reported it to the territorial marshal, who'd come out, confirm the death, and arrange for burial. After that, the place had been abandoned. Thornhill had no heirs anyone could find, and the bank that held the mortgage on the property had decided the remote location made it worthless. So the mansion just sat, slowly decaying, becoming the subject of ghost stories and dares. But what if the prospectors hadn't found everything? What if Thornhill, paranoid and isolated, had hidden supplies in places that a casual search wouldn't reveal? Rich men didn't get rich by being careless. They built safes, secret rooms, hidden compartments. I'm going to search the house, Margaret said, making the decision as she spoke the words. Properly, thoroughly. There's got to be something here we can use. Mom, you can't go alone. What if Rose stopped, unable to voice the fear that hung between them? What if the stories were true? What if something was waiting in the darkness? What if I don't, and your brothers and sisters starve to death? Margaret's voice was harder than she intended, sharpened by fear and desperation. She softened it immediately, reaching out to touch Rose's face. Honey, I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in survival. And right now, our survival depends on me finding food and water in this house. Can you watch the others? Keep the fire going? I'll stay close. I won't go far. Rose nodded, though Margaret could see the fear in her eyes. Be careful. Margaret stood up, her legs stiff and aching from hours of sitting on the cold floor. She wrapped herself in one of the salvaged blankets and picked up the fireplace poker in one hand and a burning piece of wood from the fire in the other, a makeshift torch that cast wild, dancing shadows on the walls. The entrance hall looked different in the middle of the night, more menacing. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her with disapproving eyes. The furniture under its dusty sheets looked like crouching figures frozen in the act of rising. The grand staircase leading up into darkness looked like a throat waiting to swallow her. She started with the ground floor, moving methodically from room to room. The dining room had a table that could seat 20, all the chairs neatly pushed in as if awaiting for guests who would never arrive. The china cabinet was empty. Presumably, the prospectors had taken the valuable dishes and silverware. The kitchen was large, built for servants to prepare elaborate meals, with a massive wood-burning stove and cupboards that reached to the ceiling. Margaret's heart leaped when she found the cupboard, but her hope died quickly. They were empty, completely cleaned out. Not even a jar of preserves or a bag of flour remained. Someone had taken everything edible long ago, but there was a hand pump at the sink. Margaret worked the handle experimentally, and after a dozen strokes, brown water began to trickle out. She kept pumping until it ran clear and cold. Water. They had water. That was something. That was survival for at least a few more days. She found cups in a cabinet, simple tin cup that the prospectors had apparently deemed not worth stealing, and filled several with water to carry back to the children. As she worked the pump, her torchlight caught something she'd missed before, a door, partially hidden behind a tall cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. Margaret set down the cups and pushed at the cabinet. It was heavy, solid wood, but she managed to slide it a few inches, revealing the door more fully. It was locked, but the wood around the lock was old and caught with moisture damage. She wedged the fireplace poker into the gap between door and frame and pried. The wood splintered with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. Margaret froze, listening for any reaction from upstairs or from wherever else in this vast building someone or something might be hiding. Nothing. Just the wind and her own hammering heart. She pried again, and the door popped open, revealing steep wooden stairs leading down into complete darkness. A basement or a cellar. Places where people stored things. Places where a paranoid rich man might hide his most precious possessions. "Hello?" Margaret called down into the darkness, her voice echoing off unseen walls. "Is anyone down there?" No answer, just the smell rising up from below. Not the smell of death or decay, but something else. Machine oil, metal, old tobacco, and underneath it all, something that smelled like canvas, wood polish. She descended slowly, her torch held high, the fireplace poker ready in her other hand. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step announcing her presence. If someone was down here, they knew she was coming. The basement was enormous, far larger than she'd expected. It ran under the entire footprint of the mansion, divided into multiple rooms by walls of stone and timber. Her torchlight revealed old mining equipment in the first room. Picks, shovels, coils of rope, rusted machinery that must have come from the Golden Promise mine when it was still operating. The second room was full of empty wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, all bearing shipping labels from distant cities. San Francisco, Seattle, Vancouver, even New York. Thornhill had imported everything, had built his mansion in the wilderness, and then filled it with luxuries brought from the outside world at enormous expense. The man must have been phenomenally wealthy, at least for a time. Margaret moved deeper into the basement, following the stronger scent of tobacco and oil. The third room stopped her cold. It contained a cot with a sleeping bag on it, a small camping stove, empty tin cans that had contained beans and soup, a lantern with oil still in it, and most telling of all, a pipe resting in an ashtray, the tobacco in it no more than a few days old. Someone had been living down here recently, very recently. The footprints she'd seen upstairs in the dust weren't old, weren't her imagination. Someone was in this house with them, someone who'd been camping in the basement, using the abandoned mansion as shelter. Margaret's mind raced. A trapper, a prospector, a drifter, someone dangerous, someone who might see her and her children as threats, or worse, as victims. She turned to leave to get back to her children, but froze when her torchlight caught something at the far end of the basement. Another door, but this one was different from every other door in the mansion. It was made of steel, thick, heavy steel, like the door of a bank vault, and it had a combination lock, the kind used on safes, built right into the metal. The door itself was clean, no dust, no rust, no cobweb. Someone had been maintaining this door. Someone had been using it. Margaret approached slowly, her heart pounding. She reached out and touched the cold metal, running her fingers over the smooth surface. The lock was a dial that went from 0 to 99, with a handle next to it that wouldn't budge when she tried it. Whatever was behind this door, it was important enough that Thornhill had gone to extraordinary expense to protect it, and someone in the present day knew about it, had been down here, had perhaps been trying to get it open. The question was, what could be so valuable that it needed this level of security? What would a man hide behind a steel door in the basement of his mansion? Margaret tried the handle again, putting her weight into it, but it didn't move even a fraction of an inch. The lock mechanism was solid, well-made, probably custom-built by a safe company and shipped north at great expense. She stepped back, studying the door, thinking there had to be a way to open it. Combination locks could be picked, or the combinations could be guessed if you knew enough about the person who'd set them. People often use significant dates, ages, addresses, numbers that meant something to them, but she knew almost nothing about Clayton Thornhill, except that he'd owned a mine, built a mansion, gone crazy, and died alone. Not exactly a wealth of biographical detail to work with. A sound behind her made Margaret spin around, torch and poker raised, ready to fight. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, silhouetted against the faint light from above. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in furs and heavy canvas. For a moment, Margaret's heart stopped, thinking it was Thomas, that somehow he'd survived the avalanche and come to find them. Then the figure stepped forward into her torchlight, and she saw a stranger's face, a man's face, weathered and hard, with ice-blue eyes that reflected her flame like an animal's eyes in the night. "So," the man said, his voice rough as gravel scraped over stone. "You found it." Margaret raised the poker higher, putting herself between this stranger and the stair, between him and her children. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man raised his hands slowly, showing they were empty. "Easy, ma'am. I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Jacob Reeves. I was a territorial marshal until a few months back. Now I'm just a man trying to right some wrong." "What are you doing in this house?" "Same thing you are, I imagine. Waiting out the storm. Though I've been here a bit longer than you. About 2 months, Margaret's mind reeled. This man had been living here for 2 months, hiding in the basement while she and her children slept by the fire upstairs, watching them. "You've been spying on us," she said, her voice cold with anger and fear. "No, avoiding you. There's a difference, see. I've been living in the attic, actually, up on the 3rd floor. Got a room up there with a stove and a window. Been keeping to myself, staying out of sight. Wasn't expecting anyone else to show up, especially not in the middle of the worst blizzard in 40 years. Why are you here? What do you want with that door?" Reeves looked at the steel door, and something in his expression shifted, became harder, more determined. "What's behind that door is justice, Mrs. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Fletcher. Margaret Fletcher." Something flickered in Reeves's eye. Recognition. Fletcher. Thomas Fletcher's widow? Margaret's blood ran cold. "How do you know about my husband?" "Because I know about all of them. All 17 men who died in Thornhill's mines over the past 30 years, including Thomas, including my own father." Reeves's voice was bitter now, edged with old pain and fresh anger. Clayton Thornhill was a thief and a murderer, Mrs. Fletcher. And what's behind that door is proof. Proof that could change everything for families like yours, like mine. I don't understand. Then let me explain. Reeves moved closer and Margaret noticed he was careful to keep his movements slow, non-threatening. That door leads to Thornhill's vault, his personal safe room. Inside it is everything he spent his last years hoarding. Gold from the mines, documents proving how he stole land claims, evidence of the safety violations that killed our husband and father. Everything we'd need to get real justice, not the legal kind that takes years and costs money working people don't have. If you're was a marshal. I resigned 3 months ago when I realized the law wasn't going to help anyone. Thornhill's been dead for 22 years, but his estate is still tied up in probate. His claims got sold to other mining companies who used the same corner-cutting tactics that killed my father. The families of the dead men got nothing, less than nothing. They got debt and poverty and nobody in authority giving a damn. Margaret stared at this stranger who claimed to know her husband's name, who claimed to be seeking justice for deaths decades old. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Even if I believe you, she said carefully, even if everything you're saying is true, that door is locked. We can't get inside. Reeves smiled grimly. We can if you can figure out the combination. I've been trying for 2 months with no luck. But you, Mrs. Fletcher, you just got here. Fresh eyes, fresh perspective. Maybe you'll see something I've missed. I don't know anything about Clayton Thornhill. You don't need to. You just need to think like a desperate man hiding his greatest treasure. What numbers would he choose? What would mean enough to him to remember under any circumstances? Margaret looked at the steel door, then back at the children sleeping upstairs by the fire, then at this strange man who claimed to be seeking justice for her dead husband. She thought about the empty cupboards in the kitchen, the hunger gnawing at her children's bellies, the storm that could last days more. If there was food behind that door, supplies, anything at all that could keep her family alive, she had to try. All right, she said, but first, you're going to come upstairs and meet my children. You're going to sit where I can see you while I tend to them. And then, and only then, will I think about helping you with that door. Agreed? Reeves nodded slowly. Agreed. Lead the way, Mrs. Fletcher. As they climbed the stairs back toward the firelight and the sleeping children, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil, or maybe with an angel in disguise. Only time would tell which. And time was something they were rapidly running out of. Margaret led Jacob Reeves up the stairs from the basement, her fireplace poker still gripped tightly in one hand, the torch in the other, casting wild shadows on the wall. Every instinct she'd developed since becoming a widow screamed at her to be cautious, to protect her children first and ask questions later. But another part of her, the part that had spent 8 months watching her babies go hungry while the people responsible for their father's death faced no consequences, wanted desperately to believe this man's story. When they emerged into the great hall, Rose was awake and on her feet, holding a heavy piece of firewood like a club. Her eyes went wide when she saw the strange man following her mother out of the darkness. Mom, get away from him! It's all right, Rose. Lower the wood. This is Mr. Reeves. He's been sheltering here from the storm, just like us. Margaret's voice was calm but firm, the voice she used when she needed her children to obey without question. Rose didn't lower the wood. He could be dangerous. He could have hurt us any time in the past few hours if that was his intention, Margaret interrupted. Instead, he stayed hidden and left us alone. That speaks to character, doesn't it? She looked at Reeves meaningfully. The character of a man who respects boundaries and doesn't threaten women and children. Reeves raised his hands again, this time for Rose's benefit. Your mother's right, miss. I'm not here to cause trouble, just here to wait out the storm, same as you folks. In the basement for 2 months? Rose's voice was skeptical, and Margaret felt a flash of pride at her daughter's sharp thinking. In the attic, actually. The basement's just where I've been working. Reeves gestured toward the stairs leading up. 3rd floor, northwest corner room. Still has a working stove up there and a window that faces away from the weather. Been quite comfortable, all things considered. Margaret studied him more carefully in the better light of the fire. He was probably in his late 40s, though the hard living of Alaska made it difficult to tell. His face was lined and weathered, with a scar running through his left eyebrow, an old injury, long healed. His hands, when he'd raised them, showed calluses in the right places for manual labor. In his clothes, though worn, were well made, well maintained. He had the look of a man who'd been educated but had chosen, or been forced into, a rougher life. Why 2 months? Margaret asked. What kind of work in a basement takes 2 months? The kind where you're trying to crack a safe you don't have the combination for. Reeves moved slowly toward the fire, keeping his movements obvious and non-threatening. May I sit? I'd like to show you something, and it's easier to explain if we're all comfortable. Margaret nodded, positioning herself between Reeves and the pile of sleeping children. Rose remained standing, her makeshift weapon still ready. Reeves reached into his coat slowly and pulled out a worn leather journal. This is why I'm here. This is why I resigned my commission and spent the better part of a year tracking down this place. He opened the journal and held it toward the firelight so Margaret could see. The pages were covered in cramped handwriting, lists of names and dates and numbers. Many of the names had red marks next to them. Some had notes in the margin. I started this journal 5 years ago, Reeves said, his voice taking on a different quality. Harder, more focused. After my father died in the Golden Promise Mine cave-in of of 1947. The official report said it was an unavoidable accident, act of God. No one was at fault. But you didn't believe that, Margaret said softly. I didn't, because my father had written to me 2 weeks before he died, telling me he was worried about the safety condition, telling me the company was pushing them to work in areas that hadn't been properly shored up, that the timber supports were rotting, that he'd reported it multiple times and been told to shut up and work or find another job. Reeves's jaw clenched. He found another job, all right, in a grave. Rose had lowered her weapon slightly, listening despite herself. So I started investigating, Reeves continued, started going through old territorial records, talking to other families, requesting mine inspection reports, and I found a pattern. The Golden Promise mine wasn't the first Thornhill operation to have unavoidable accidents. It wasn't even the 10th. He flipped through the journal, showing page after page of names. Margaret recognized some of old-timers from the valley, men who died when she was young, men whose widows still lived in poverty decades later. 17 deaths over 30 years, Reeves has said. 17 men who died because Clayton Thornhill cared more about profit margins than human lives. Cave-ins that could have been prevented with proper supports. Explosions that happened because he bought cheap, unstable dynamite. Avalanches, he looked directly at Margaret, in areas that his own surveyors had flagged as dangerous. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas, you're saying Thomas's death wasn't an accident. There's a report in the Territorial Archives filed 3 weeks before your husband died. A geological survey warning that the northwestern face of Mount Harding had significant avalanche risk during spring melt and recommending immediate evacuation of all mining operations in that area. No, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. No, they said it was sudden, unpredictable. They said there was no way to know. They lied. Reeves's voice was gentle now, understanding. Northern Star Mining, the company that bought the Thornhill claims after his death, received that report and ignored it, because evacuating would have meant losing 2 weeks of production, 2 weeks of profit. They decided your husband's life was worth less than 2 weeks of gold extraction. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Margaret had suspected, in the dark hours of the night when sleep wouldn't come, that Thomas's death might have been preventable. But suspecting and knowing were two entirely different things. Knowing meant that her husband had been murdered, not by a person's hand, but by a company's calculated decision that his life was acceptable collateral damage. How do you know all this? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow. Because I'm a marshal, was a marshal. I had access to files that regular citizens don't. I could request documents, interview people, follow trails that would have been closed to anyone else. He paused. And because I broke into the territorial archives after hours and photographed files that were marked as sealed for company privacy. That's illegal. Yes, it is. So is negligent homicide, but that's not stopping any. Reeves leaned forward, his voice intense. Mrs. Fletcher, Margaret, I've spent 5 years gathering evidence. 5 years building a case that could bring down not just Northern Star Mining, but every company in this territory that values profit over human life. But evidence alone isn't enough. I need leverage. I need something so damning, so undeniable that they can't bury it with lawyers and bribed sealed documents. And you think that's in Thornhill's vault? I know it is, because I found his personal journal upstairs in his office. Not the official mine rec. Those are public, but his private journal where he kept track of things he didn't want anyone else to know. Reeves pulled another book from his coat, older and more worn than his own journal. Listen to this. Entry from March 1928. Jenkins insists we need to shore up Tunnel 7 before proceeding. I told him we don't have time for excessive caution. Production quotas must be met. If a few men get hurt learning to be more careful, that's the cost of doing business. Margaret felt sick. Or this one from June 1925. The territorial inspector is asking too many questions about the Mercury Creek explosion. Paid him $500 to file a report blaming faulty blasting cap. Money well spent. Can't have him digging into our purchase orders. He'd see we've been buying unstable explosives at half the price of the safe variety. The difference adds up to significant save. He kept records of his own crimes. Rose's voice was shocked. Rich men often do. They think they're untouchable, so they keep meticulous records for taxes, for legal disputes, to prove their business acumen to other rich men. They never think those records will be used against them. Reeves closed the journal carefully. Thornhill went crazy in his last years, became paranoid about everyone stealing from him, so he locked everything important in that vault. His gold, his documents, his proof of ownership for dozens of mining claims, and his private records of every shady deal, every bribe, every safety violation that led to a death. But if he's been dead for over 20 years, why hasn't anyone opened the vault already? Because no one knew it existed. The prospectors who found his body searched the house, found enough portable valuables to make it worth their while, and reported the death. The territorial marshal at the time did a cursory investigation, ruled it death by natural causes, starvation, or madness, or both, and closed the case. Thornhill's distant relatives inherited the estate but never came north to see it. They sold the mining claims to pay his debts and abandoned the mansion because it was worth less than the cost of maintaining it. So how did you find out about the vault? Dumb luck, honestly. I was going through old mine company records and found bills of sale from the Alaska Safe Company in Seattle. Seattle. Thornhill had commissioned a custom vault door in 1927, paid a fortune to have it shipped north and installed. The company kept detailed records because the job was so unusual, installing a bank-grade vault in a private residence in the middle of nowhere. I tracked down the installation crew's foreman, who's retired in Portland now. He told me exactly where the vault was built and described it in detail. Said Thornhill was obsessed with security, paranoid that everyone was out to steal from him. Reeves looked at the sleeping children, his expression softened slightly. I came here planning to spend however long it took to get that vault open. Brought supplies for 6 months if necessary, and I've been down there 2 months trying every combination I can think of based on dates from his life, anniversaries, mine claim numbers, everything. Nothing's worked. And now you want my help. Margaret's mind was racing, fitting pieces together. Why, Betty? What makes you think I can figure out something you haven't in 2 months? Because you're desperate, because your children are hungry, and that makes you think differently than someone who has full belly and time to spare. Desperation gives clarity, makes you see angles you'd miss otherwise. He met her eyes. And because those children over there deserve the truth about their father's death, they deserve justice. You all do. Margaret looked at her sleeping babies, curled up together by the fire. Samuel's face was peaceful in sleep, but she could see the hollows under his eyes, the way his cheekbones were starting to show through his baby fat. They were starving. Slowly but surely starving. What's in the vault besides documents? She asked quietly. You mentioned gold. According to the journal, Thornhill liquidated everything he could in his final months and converted it to gold bars. He was convinced the banks couldn't be trusted, that paper money was worthless, that only gold had real value. The journal mentions at least 200 pounds of gold, maybe more. 200 pounds of gold. At current prices, that was, Margaret's mind struggled with the math, hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune beyond anything she could imagine. If we get the vault open, she said slowly, what happens to the gold? Legally, it belongs to Thornhill's heirs. Practically, they don't even know it exists, and I'm not planning to tell them. Reeves leaned back, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. I've thought a lot about this over the past 2 months, about what justice really means. The law says that gold belongs to the heirs of a man who stole land, killed workers, and bribed officials. But real justice says it belongs to the families he destroyed. You want to steal it. It wasn't a question. I want to redistribute it to the 17 families who lost fathers and husbands, to the dozens of people Thornhill cheated out of their claims, to fund legal battles against the mining companies that are still using his playbook to get away with murder. He paused. And yes, I want some of it to go to you and your children, because your husband died for Northern Star's profit margin, and you deserve compensation for that. Margaret's head spun. What he was proposing was theft, grand larceny on a massive scale. It was illegal, immoral by conventional standards, and could land them both in prison if they were caught. It was also the only real justice her family would ever see. I need to think, she said finally. I need to... A sound from upstairs froze them both. A long, slow creaking, like someone walking across old floorboard. Then silent. Then another creak. Rose grabbed her wood club again. What was that? Just the house settling, Reeves said, but his voice lacked conviction. Old buildings make noises in storms like this. The temperature changes, wood expands and contracts. Another creak, closer this time, coming from the grand staircase. Margaret stood slowly, picking up the fireplace poker. You said you've been living in the attic for 2 months. Yes. Have you heard sounds like that before? Reeves's silence was answer enough. Mr. Reeves, Margaret's voice was very calm, very controlled. Is there something else in this house? Something you haven't told me about? Before he could answer, one of the younger children, Peter, woke with a scream. Mama, there's a man on the stairs. A man with no face. Margaret spun around, following her son's terrified gaze to the grand staircase. In the dancing firelight and shadows, it was hard to see clearly, but there was something there. A shape, tall, dark, standing motionless on the landing halfway up. Who's there? Margaret called out, her voice echoing in the vast hall. Show yourself. The shape didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there watching. Then slowly it began to descend the stairs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. As it moved into the better light, Margaret saw what had terrified her son. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. But his face was wrong, too smooth, too blank, like a mannequin or a mask. No, not a mask. A face wrapped completely in cloth, with only dark spaces where eyes should be. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, standing at the edge of the firelight. When it spoke, its voice was muffled by the cloth, but still audible. Rough, damaged, like someone who'd screamed themselves hoarse. You shouldn't be here, it said. None of you should be here. This house is mine, has been mine for 22 years. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice water because she recognized that voice. Recognized it from stories old Henrik had told, from whispered legends shared over winter fires. Clayton Thornhill, she whispered. You're supposed to be dead. The wrapped figure tilted its head, considering. Dead? Yes, I suppose I am. But dead men don't leave this house, Mrs. Fletcher. Dead men stay, guard their treasure, wait for the living to come seeking what they shouldn't have. It took a step forward, and Margaret saw that his hands were wrapped too. The cloth stained dark with something that might have been blood or might have been rot. Now, it said, someone needs to explain why you've broken into my home and what you plan to do about the fact that you've seen things you shouldn't have seen. The fire flickered, the wind howled, and Margaret Fletcher realized that the storm outside might not be the most dangerous thing they faced in Thornhill Mansion. Not by a long shot. For a long moment, nobody moved. Margaret stood frozen, the fireplace poker raised but useless against whatever this thing was that stood before them. Rose had gone pale as snow, her wood club trembling in her hand. The younger children were waking now, their sleepy confusion turning to terror as they saw the wrapped figure standing at the edge of the firelight. Jacob Reeves was the first to break the spell. He stood slowly, his hand moving to his coat where Margaret could see the outline of what must be a pistol. "Don't," the wrapped figure said without looking at him. "Bullets don't work on dead men, Marshal Reeves. Trust me, I know. I tried that solution myself before I accepted what I'd come." "You're not a ghost," Reeves said, but his voice lacked certainty. "Ghosts aren't real. You're a man, just a man." "I was a man once. Clayton Thornhill, owner of the Golden Promise mine, builder of this mansion, the richest man in the territory." The figure gestured around the grand hall with wrapped hands. "Look at what my riches bought me. A prison, a tomb, 22 years of darkness and solitude." Margaret found her voice, though it came out shaky. "They found your body. In 1930, they found a body, not mine." The wrapped figure moved closer, and Margaret could smell something emanating from it. Not rot exactly, but something old and wrong, like dried herbs and formaldehyde in winter air. "There was a prospector, name of Davy. He broke in during the winter of 1929, looking for anything valuable to steal. Found me in the basement, found the vault, tried to force me to open it." The figure's head tilted, as if remembered. "I had gone quite mad by then, hadn't eaten in weeks, could barely speak. When Davies threatened me, tried to beat the combination out of me, I fought back. The altercation ended badly for him, for both of us, really." "You killed him," Reeves said. "I did, and then I had a corpse to dispose of and a decision to make." The wrapped figure gestured to itself. "Davies and I were similar in build, similar in age. When they found my body in the basement months later, they assumed it was me. Why wouldn't they? Everyone thought I was alone here. No one knew about Davies." Margaret's mind reeled. "So you've been here, alive, for 22 years? Hiding? Why not just leave?" "Because I couldn't." The voice behind the wrappings held genuine anger. "I tried, Mrs. Fletcher. God knows I tried, but every time I got more than 100 yards from this house, something happened. My heart would seize up, my lungs would stop working. The last time I attempted it, I collapsed in the snow and woke up 3 days later back in the house with no memory of how I got there." "That's impossible," Rose whispered. "Is it? Is anything impossible after what I did? The men I killed through negligence and greed, the families I destroyed, the land I stole?" The figure's shoulders slumped. "I'm bound here, cursed if you believe in such things, or perhaps just too cowardly to truly die. Either way, this house is my world now, has been for more than 2 decades." Reeves was studying the figure with the intensity of an investigator. "The wrappings, why cover your face?" A sound came from behind the cloth, a laugh, but broken and bitter. "Because you don't want to see what's underneath, Marshal. 22 years of living in darkness, of surviving on rats and melted snow and desperation does things to a man, things that can't be undone." "Show us," Margaret said, surprising herself with the demand. "If you want us to believe any of this, show us your face. You'll regret asking." "Maybe, but I need to know if you're real or if I'm losing my mind in this storm." The wrapped figure stood still for a moment, then slowly, very slowly, began to unwrap the cloth around its head. Layer after layer came away, yellowed bandages that had once been white, revealing inch by inch what lay beneath. Margaret heard Rose gasp, heard Peter start to cry. Even Reeves took an involuntary step backward. The face that emerged was human, but barely. The skin was gray-white, stretched tight over the skull like parchment over a drum. The eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, but still alive, still aware, burning with an intelligence that was terrible to behold. The lips had withered away, leaving teeth permanently exposed in a death's head grin. Hair hung in long white strings from a spotted scalp. It was the face of a corpse that refused to die. The face of a man who'd been dead for years but somehow kept breathing, kept thinking, kept suffering. "Satisfied?" The voice was clearer now without the muffling cloth, but it was a voice that shouldn't have come from living lungs. Dry, rasping, like wind through a crypt. Margaret forced herself not to look away. How are you alive?" "I don't know. Willpower? Punishment? Maybe I made a deal with something in my final moments of sanity and forgot about it." Thornhill, because it was Thornhill, impossibly, horribly Thornhill, began rewrapping his face with practiced move. "Does it matter? I'm here. You're here, and now we have a situation to resolve." "What kind of situation?" Reeves had his hand inside his coat now, definitely on a weapon. "The kind where you know about me, and I know about you, and we need to decide what happens next." Thornhill finished wrapping his face and sat down on one of the sheet-covered chairs, the motion weary and ancient. "I've been watching you, Marshal Reeves. For 2 months, I've watched you try to break into my vault, watched you study my journals, piece together my crime, plan your revenge against the companies that inherited my practice. If you've been watching, why not reveal yourself before now?" "Because I was curious to see if you'd succeed, curious whether someone could finally prove what I did, make the truth known." The wrapped head turned toward Margaret. "And then you arrived with your children, Thomas Fletcher's widow." "I remember Thomas. I remember all of them. Every man who died because of my decision." Margaret's grip tightened on the poke. "If you remember, then you know what you took from me, from my children. children. I do, and I'm sorry for whatever that's worth, which I know is nothing. Thornhill's voice held genuine remorse, which somehow made it worse. I didn't set out to be a monster, Mrs. Fletcher. I was just a man who wanted to be rich, who wanted to prove I was better than the father who called me worthless. But wealth corrupts, power corrupts, and fear of losing what you've gained, that corrupts most of all. I don't want your apologies, Margaret said coldly. I want my husband back. I want my children to have a father. I know, but I can't give you that. Thornhill leaned forward, and Margaret could see his sunken eyes glinting behind the cloth. What I can give you is something else, something that might help. We don't want anything from you, Rose said, her voice shaking but defiant. Don't you? You came here fleeing a storm with nothing. No food, no supplies. 7 children who will starve if that blizzard lasts another 3 days. Thornhill gestured toward the basement stairs. Down in my vault is enough food to last you months, enough gold to buy you a new life, enough documents to bring down the companies that are still killing men like your father. And what do you want in exchange? Reeves asked suspiciously. Truth, justice, revenge, call it what you will. Thornhill stood, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body no longer worked quite right. I'm tired, Mark. So very tired. 22 years of existing in this purgatory, watching the world outside continue while I remain trapped. 22 years of living with the memory of every man I killed, every family I destroyed. He moved to the fireplace, warming his wrapped hands over the flame. I want you to open that vault. Take everything inside, the gold, the documents, all of it. Use it to destroy what I built. Use it to make sure Northern Star Mining and every other company that followed my example the answers for their crime. Why, Margaret asked. Why help us now? Why not just let the truth stay buried with you? Because I'm already in hell, Mrs. Fletcher, and hell is watching your sins continue through others while you're powerless to stop them. Thornhill turned to face her fully. I can't leave this house, can't die properly, can't make amends for what I did, but I can help you make sure it stops. Make sure no more children lose their fathers to corporate greed. Reeves stepped forward. If you want to help, just tell us the combination. I can't because I don't remember. Thornhill's laugh was bitter. The madness took that from me years ago. I set the lock, wrote down the combination somewhere I thought I'd remember, and then promptly forgot both the numbers and where I put the key. Ironic, isn't it? I locked away my greatest treasures so securely that I trapped them even from myself. Then how are we supposed to get in? Margaret demanded. You think, you search, you look at everything with fresh eyes. Thornhill moved toward the stairs. I've been in this house too long. Everything looks the same to me now. But you're new. You'll see things I've stopped seeing, patterns I've stopped recognizing. And if we can't figure it out, then you survive on what you can find in the kitchen, in the bedroom, scattered through the house. I've been living on very little for a very long time. There are ways to make do, but your children will go hungry, Mrs. Fletcher. And when the storm passes and you leave this place, you'll have nothing but bitter memories and empty hands. He began climbing the stairs, each step careful and measured. I'll leave you to decide what you want to do. The vault is down there. The combination is somewhere in this house. Find it or don't. Help the families I destroyed or don't. It's your choice now. Wait, Reeves called after him. Where are you going? Back to the attic, back to my solitude. I've spoken more in the past hour than I have in years, and it's exhausting. Thornhill paused on the landing, looking back down at them. One more thing. The storm will last 4 more days. The snow is already 12 feet deep against the north wall and rising. If you're going to find that combination and get into the vault, you need to do it before the food runs out and desperation makes you careless. How do you know how long the storm will last? Rose asked. Because I've lived through 22 winters in this house. I know its rhythms, its moods. I know the sound the wind makes when it's halfway through its fury and the sound it makes when it's about to exhaust itself. The wrapped head tilted. 4 days, Mrs. Fletcher. 4 days to solve my riddle or 4 days to watch your children grow weak with hunger. He continued up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of the upper floors. They heard a door open and close somewhere above, and then silence except for the fire's crackle and the wind's howl. Margaret sank down beside her children, her mind spinning. A living corpse, a haunted mansion, a fortune behind a locked door, a storm that might last 4 more days. It was too much, too impossible. Mom, Rose whispered, was that real? Did we really just see? I don't know what we saw, Margaret had interrupted. I don't know what's real, but I know this. We're stuck here. We have no food. And if there's even a chance that vault contains supplies that could keep you and your brothers and sisters alive, I have to try to open it. Reeves sat down across from her, his face troubled. This changes things. If Thornhill really doesn't remember the combination, we could spend days searching and find nothing. Then we spend days searching. Margaret's voice was firm. You said you've been trying for 2 months using dates and numbers from his life. Maybe that's the wrong approach. Maybe we need to think different. How? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. She looked at her sleeping children, at their thin faces and hollow cheeks. I have to. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the world under snow and ice. Inside Thornhill Mansion, a widow, a former marshal, and 7 children settled in for a long night of questions without answers. And somewhere in the attic, a dead man who refused to die sat in darkness, listening to the house creak and groan, counting the hours until either salvation or tragedy would find the strangers who'd invaded his eternal prison. Margaret added another log to the fire and began to think. The combination was somewhere in this house. Thornhill had said so, and she would find it. Because the alternative, watching her children starve while sitting on top of a fortune they couldn't access, was unthinkable. The hunt would begin at first light, or what passed for first light in a mansion buried in snow during the worst blizzard in 40 years. Margaret Fletcher had faced loss before, had faced poverty and despair, and the brutal indifference of a world that didn't care if widows and orphans lived or died. But she'd never faced anything like this. A puzzle set by a madman, a fortune guarded by impossible security, a deadline measured in the hollow rumbling of her children's empty stomachs. She looked at Reeves, who was staring into the fire with troubled eyes. "Tell me everything you know about Thornhill," she said. "Every detail from his journals, his life, his obsessions. If we're going to crack this safe, we need to understand how he thought." Reeves nodded slowly. "All right, but Mrs. Fletcher, Margaret, you should know something. Even if we get the vault open, even if we take the gold and the documents, using them will be dangerous. The mining companies won't just accept defeat. They'll fight back. They'll use every legal trick and possibly some illegal ones to protect themselves. I know. You could end up in prison, or worse. I know that too." Margaret's voice was steady. "But right now, my children are alive, hungry. Tomorrow, they'll be alive and still hungry. The day after that, they'll start getting weak. The day after that, the youngest ones might not wake up. So yes, Mr. Reeves, I understand the risks, but those risks are in the future. Starvation is right now." She met his eyes across the fire. "Are you going to help me find that combination, or am I doing this alone?" Reeves smiled grimly. "I've come too far to quit now. Let's solve this thing." They talked through the night, comparing notes, sharing theories, building a picture of Clayton Thornhill's mind in the hope that understanding the man would unlock his secrets. Above them, in the attic, Thornhill listened and waited. And deep in the basement, behind a steel door with a combination lock, a fortune sat in darkness, waiting to be claimed by whoever proved clever enough, desperate enough, or lucky enough to find the key to its prison. The storm howled on. The fire burned low. And in Thornhill Mansion, the hunt for truth and treasure had finally begun in earnest. Dawn came without light. The windows remained blocked by snow that had piled so high against the mansion's walls that the first floor was effectively buried. What little illumination filtered through came as a dim, gray glow that did nothing to warm the vast, cold spaces of Thornhill's monument to greed and isolation. Margaret had dozed fitfully by the fire, jerking awake every time one of her children stirred or cried out in their sleep, her hand always finding the fireplace poker, ready to defend against threats both earthly and otherwise. The children woke hungry, and Margaret's heart broke anew at the plaintive way little Samuel asked for breakfast, his voice small and hopeful, as if maybe this morning would be different from the night before. She had nothing to give them except water from the kitchen pump, which she heated in a dented pot she'd found in a cupboard and served in the tin cup, telling them it was warming soup and that real food would come soon. Rose knew better. At 14, she understood the desperation in her mother's eyes, the false brightness of her voice. But she played along for the sake of the younger, helping them sip the warm water slowly, pretending it was nourishing, acting as if this were just another adventure rather than a slow slide towards starvation. Jacob Reeves emerged from wherever he'd spent the night. Margaret suspected he'd been prowling the house, unable to sleep, driven by his own demons and obsessions. He looked haggard in the dim light, his weathered face even more lined than before, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "I've been thinking about the combination all night," he said without preamble, settling near the fire with the journals and papers he'd accumulated over his months of solitary research. Thornhill was obsessed with numbers. His mining journals are full of calculation, yield projection, profit margins. Everything was quantified, measured, recorded. Margaret nodded, trying to focus through the fog of exhaustion and worry. "So we look for numbers that meant something special to him. Numbers he couldn't forget, even in madness. That's what I've been doing for 2 months. Birth dates, death dates, the date he filed his first claim, the date the Golden Promise opened, the date it closed. None of them worked." Reeves spread papers on the floor between them. "But maybe I've been thinking about it wrong. Maybe it's not about dates at all. What else would it be? Amounts, quantities, the things he valued most." Reeves pulled out one of Thornhill's personal journals, the pages yellowed and brittle. "Listen to this entry from 1927. Today's yield from shaft 7, 42 ounces. Purest gold I've seen in years. At current prices, worth nearly $1,500 from a single day's work. This is why I came north. This is what makes all the hardship worthwhile." Margaret leaned closer, studying the faded hand. 42 ounces. Could that be part of the combination? Maybe, or maybe it's the dollar amount, 1,500, or some other figure entirely. Reeves flipped through more pages, his finger tracing lines of cramped text. "The problem is there are hundreds of numbers in these journals. Thousands. How do we know which ones mattered to him? We asked someone who knew him." Margaret stood up, her decision made. "We asked Thornhill himself." Reeves looked skeptical. "You really think that thing upstairs is going to help us? It said it doesn't remember the combination. Maybe not consciously, but the human mind works in strange ways. Sometimes the things we forget on purpose are still there, buried under layers of time and trauma." Margaret had read about this in a medical journal years ago, back when she'd had time and money for such luxury. "If we ask him the right question, maybe something will shake loose. And how do we find him? This house has got to be 20 rooms at least. He said he lives in the attic, northwest corner. Margaret picked up her torch, a new one, since the old had burned down to nothing, and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the cold that grew more intense the farther you got from the fire. Rose, you're in charge again. Keep everyone by the fire. Don't let anyone wander off. We'll be back soon. Rose nodded, trying to look braver than a 14-year-old should have to be. Margaret and Reeves climbed the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in the vast silence of the house. The second floor was a maze of bedrooms and sitting rooms, all furnished with the expensive taste of a man who'd had more money than sense. Beds with carved posts stood unmade, their linens rotting. Wardrobes hung open, revealing suits that moths had reduced to lace. Mirrors reflected their torchlight in fractured, distorted ways that made Margaret's skin crawl. They found the stairs to the attic, hidden behind a door that looked like a closet. The steps were narrow and steep, meant for servants rather than the master of the house. At the top, another door stood slightly ajar, yellow lamplight spilling through the crack. Margaret knocked, the sound absurdly polite given the circumstances. Mr. Thornhill, it's Margaret Fletcher. May we come in? Silence. Then, it's not locked. Nothing in this house is locked except what matters most. They entered a surprisingly organized space. The attic room had been converted into living quarters. A cot with neatly folded blankets, a small wood stove that radiated blessed warmth, a table with an oil lamp, and stacks of books lining makeshift shelves. It was the room of someone who'd been living here not for months, but for years, with everything arranged for maximum efficiency and comfort. Thornhill sat in a chair by the single window, looking out at the white chaos of the blizzard. His face was wrapped again, but Margaret could see his eyes through the cloth, ancient eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to look away. You want to ask me about the combination, he said without turning around. You want me to remember what my mind mercifully allowed me to forget. Can you try? Margaret moved closer, keeping her voice gentle. Not for us, for the families you destroyed, for the children who deserve better than what they've been given. Pretty words, but we both know you want it for your own children, as you should. Thornhill finally turned to face them. I don't blame you, Mrs. Fletcher. Maternal instinct overrides morality. It's one of the few pure things left in this corrupt world. Can you help us or not? Reeves asked impatiently. I can try. Sit, both of you. Thornhill gestured to a rough bench against the wall. Tell me what you've already attempted. Maybe hearing it will trigger something. For the next hour, Reeves recounted every combination he had tried. Dates from Thornhill's life, from his business records, from territorial history, numbers from the journal, mathematical sequences, random attempts born of desperation. Thornhill listened without interrupting, his rapt head tilted in concentration. When Reeves finally finished, the old man, if he could still be called that, sat silent for a long moment. You're thinking too literally, he said finally. Too obviously. A man who's gone mad enough to lock himself in a mansion with his fortune isn't going to use simple dates or amounts. He's going to use something symbolic, something that meant everything to him in that moment of paranoia. Like what? Margaret asked. The thing he feared most, the thing he was trying to protect against. Thornhill stood and moved to a trunk in the corner, opening it to reveal more journal, more paper, the accumulated detritus of a life spent obsessing over wealth. In my final months of sanity, I became convinced that someone was going to steal everything from me. My goal, my claims, my legacy. He pulled out a newspaper, yellowed and fragile. The headline read, Territorial Marshal Investigates Mining Fraud. The date was March 1928. This article, this was what broke me. Some crusading lawman decided to look into my business practices, started asking questions I couldn't safely answer. I became convinced he was going to take everything, that the government was coming for me, that I'd end up in prison or worse. Who was the marshal? Reeves asked, leaning forward. Name was Carter. No, Cartwright. James Cartwright. Thornhill's voice was distant, remember. He came here twice, asking about accident reports, safety violations, claim dispute. The second time, I threatened him with my shotgun and told him to get off my property. He left, but I knew he'd be back, knew he'd bring others, knew they'd take everything. So what did you do? I prepared, liquidated assets, converted everything to gold, moved it all into the vault I'd had installed, and then I set the combination to something Cartwright would never guess, something only I would know. Thornhill's wrapped hands trembled slightly, but now I can't remember what it was. The madness took it from me, along with so much else. Margaret stood and began examining the papers scattered around the room, looking for patterns, for clues. What about Cartwright himself? Did you have his badge number, his age, any information about him? I had. Thornhill paused, his ruined face turning toward a stack of papers on the table. I had his background, did my own investigation, hired a private detective in Seattle to dig up dirt I could use against him if necessary. It's in here somewhere. He began sorting through papers with the careful movements of someone whose hands no longer work quite right. Finally, he pulled out a typewritten report, several pages held together with a rusted clip. Here, everything about James Cartwright, born 1879, joined the Territorial Marshal Service in 1902, decorated for bravery in 1915 when he tracked down the Jenkins gang, married 3 children, lived in Fairbanks, died. Thornhill stopped. Died in 1929. Heart attack at age 50. They gave him a hero's funeral. Reeves took the report and scanned it quickly. What numbers here could work as a combination. Birth year, badge number, try them all, Margaret said. We have nothing to lose. They descended back to the basement, the three of them, a desperate widow, a former marshal seeking justice, and a dead man who refused to properly die. The steel door waited for them, impassive and immovable, guarding its secret. Reeves tried the numbers from Cartwright's life systematic. Birth year, 1879. Service start, 1902. Age at death, 50. Badge number, listed in the report as 227. None worked. The lock remained sealed. Think, Margaret urged. What would a paranoid man use? What would feel safe to him? Thornhill stood before the door like a supplicant before an altar. Something that represented my enemy's defeat. Something that proved I'd won. His wrapped hand touched the cold steel. The date Cartwright died. That's when I knew I was safe, that my secrets would stay buried. What was the date? Margaret asked urgently. July 14th, 1929. Thornhill's voice was barely a whisper. 7/14/29. Reeves spun the dial with trembling hand. Right to 7, left to 14, right to 29. He pulled the handle. Nothing. Still locked. Maybe it's the full year, Margaret suggested. 7/14/1929. The lock only goes to 99, Reeves said, frustration creeping into his voice. They tried variations, different formats, different interpretations. Nothing worked. Margaret felt despair creeping in, cold and heavy. They were so close. The answer had to be here, had to be in these numbers somewhere. But the combination eluded them like smoke through fingers. Wait, Thornhill said suddenly. Wait, not when he died, when I learned he died. The newspaper arrived 3 days late because of a summer storm. I remember because I was sitting in my office upstairs reading by lamplight when I saw his obituary. The date on that newspaper, that's when I knew I was truly safe. What was the date? Margaret's heart was pounding. July 17th, 3 days after he died. Thornhill's eyes were closed behind the wrappings, remembering it. July 17th, 1929, 7/17/29. Reeves aligned the dial again. Right to 7, left to 17, right to 29. He gripped the handle, whispered a prayer to gods he probably didn't believe in, and pulled. The lock disengaged with a click that sounded like the most beautiful music in the world. The heavy door swung open on hinges that, despite decades of disuse, moved smoothly and silently. Someone, probably Thornhill during his long imprisonment, had been maintaining this door, oiling the hinges, keeping the mechanism clean. Beyond the door, darkness waited, and the smell that wafted out, Margaret almost wept with the relief. Food. She could smell preserved food, coffee, tobacco, the scent of supplies carefully stored. Reeves lit his torch and stepped inside, Margaret close behind. Thornhill remained at the threshold, as if unable or unwilling to enter the vault he'd built. What the torchlight revealed made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. The vault was larger than she'd expected, perhaps 15 feet square, with walls lined with shelves, and those shelves were packed with supplies. Hundreds of cans, fruits, vegetables, meats, all sealed in commercial tins designed to last for years. Bags of coffee beans, still sealed. Bricks of tea, barrels of flour and sugar, kept dry in the sealed room. Dried beans and rice in airtight containers. Medical supplies, bandages, antiseptics, even bottles of laudanum for pain. Blankets, warm and clean, vacuum sealed in waterproof packages. Lanterns, oil, matches, candles. Everything a man would need to survive an indefinite siege. But that wasn't what made Margaret gasp. In the center of the vault, on a heavy wooden table, were gold bars. Dozens of them stacked like firewood, each one stamped with the Golden Promise mine seal and a weight designation. The torchlight made them glow like captured sunlight, beautiful and terrible at the same time. At current market prices, Margaret was looking at a fortune worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, enough to buy security for her children for the rest of their lives, enough to never worry about hunger or cold or poverty again. But stacked next to the gold, in careful rows, were filing cabinets, steel cabinets with glass fronts, and through the glass, Margaret could see files, documents, papers. The evidence, Reeves breathed, moving toward the cabinets like a man in a trance. Everything we need to bring them down. It's all here. He opened the first cabinet and pulled out a file at random. Inside were mining reports, safety violation notices, payoff records to territorial officials. Another file contained claim dispute documents showing how Thornhill had used legal technicalities and bribery to steal land from legitimate prospectors. A third file was labeled simply deaths. Inside were internal memos acknowledging safety concerns, followed by decisions to ignore those concerns in favor of production quota. Each memo was followed by an accident report and a death certificate. 17 files total, one for each man who'd died. Reeves pulled out a file dated 1952, Thomas Fletcher's file. Inside was a surveyor's report warning about avalanche danger on Mount Harding, followed by a memo from Northern Star Mining Management. Risk acceptable given production value of area. Continue operations. Offer minimal compensation to families in event of accidents. Margaret read those words 3 times before they fully penetrated. Her husband's life, the father of her 7 children, had been evaluated and deemed an acceptable risk in a memo written by men who would never set foot in a mine shaft themselves. "Mama?" Samuel's voice called from upstairs, thin and frightened. "Mama, where are you?" Reality crashed back. Margaret turned from the files and grabbed an armful of canned goods. "We feed the children first. Everything else comes after." She ran up the stairs, Reeves following with more supplies. They burst into the great hall where the children waited, and the joy on their faces when they saw the food was something Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She opened cans with the vigor of someone saving lives, which in a sense she was. Peaches in heavy syrup, corned beef, crackers that were still crisp despite being stored for years. She distributed it with shaking hands, watching her babies eat, watching color return to their cheeks, watching hope return to their eyes. Only when the children were fed and warm and starting to smile again did Margaret allow herself to think about what came next. The gold, the document, the proof of crimes spanning decades, and the choice she now had to make. Take the treasure and run, or use it to burn down the system that had killed her husband. She looked at Reeves, who was studying the files with the intensity of a man who'd found his life's purpose. She looked at Thornhill, still standing in the doorway of the basement, a ghost bound to the scene of his crimes. She looked at her children, finally eating real food, finally safe from immediate starvation. And Margaret Fletcher made her decision. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly, "how do we make them pay?" The storm raged for 3 more days, just as Thornhill had predicted. But inside the mansion, everything had changed. With the vault open and its treasures accessible, Margaret's family no longer faced starvation. They ate well for the first time in months. Canned peaches and beef, crackers with real butter that had been preserved in wax, coffee that Margaret brewed strong and sweet for herself and Rose, while the younger children drank powdered milk mixed with melted snow. But food was only the beginning of what the vault contained. During those 3 days of enforced isolation, while the blizzard buried the world outside under 15 feet of snow, Margaret Fletcher and Jacob Reeves planned a revolution. They spread the documents across the Great Hall floor, organizing them by date, by crime, by victim. 17 death files became the foundation of their case. Each one contained the same damning pattern. Internal warnings about safety hazards, management decisions to ignore those warnings, accident reports that blame the victims, and minimal compensation offered to families who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back. Thomas Fletcher's file was particularly detailed. The surveyor's report warning about avalanche danger was dated 3 weeks before his death. The memo dismissing that warning and ordering continued operations was signed by 3 Northern Star mining executives, all of whom were still alive and still working for the company. The accident report, filed the day after Thomas died, blamed unpredictable natural phenomena and recommended no changes to company policy. The compensation offered to Margaret had been $20 in a suggestion that she remarry quick. "This is enough," Reeves said on the second day, looking at the spread of evidence with satisfaction. "This is enough to bring criminal charges. Negligent homicide at minimum, possibly manslaughter. The executives who signed these memos can't claim ignorance. The paper trail is clear." "Will it work?" Margaret asked, nursing a cup of coffee while watching her children play near the fire. They were different children than they'd been 3 days ago. Healthier, happier, laughing in a way she'd almost forgotten they could. "Will the law actually punish rich men for killing poor ones?" "I don't know," Reeves admitted. 5 years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now, I've seen too much of how the system really works. But with evidence this clear, with deaths this well documented, they'll have to do something. The public pressure alone will force action. And if they don't," Margaret's voice was hard, "if the courts dismiss it, if the lawyers find loopholes, if justice fails again, then we use the gold." Reeves's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "We take Thornhill's fortune and we use it to fund a different kind of justice. Civil lawsuits against every company that's ever cut corners on safety. Buying newspapers to publish the truth they try to hide. Hiring the best lawyers money can buy to fight for every family that's been wrong." Margaret thought about this, about becoming the kind of person who used stolen gold to wage war against corporations, about crossing lines she'd never imagined crossing, about becoming someone her husband might not recognize. Then she thought about Samuel asking for breakfast with that heartbreaking hope in his voice, about Rose trying to be brave while starving, about all the other families out there living her nightmare, watching their children go hungry while the people responsible for their suffering prosper. "All right," she said, "we do both. We try the legal route first, and if that fails, we fight dirty." Thornhill had been a presence throughout these days, but not an intrusion. He came and went like a ghost, which, in a sense, he was, observing their planning, occasionally offering insights into the business practices he'd pioneered and that others had copied. He seemed both horrified and fascinated by the systematic analysis of his crime, watching them turn his legacy of greed into ammunition for justice. On the third night, as the wind finally began to die down and the snow stopped falling, he sat with them by the fire and told a story. Not the sanitized version from newspapers or the ghost story version from local legend, but the truth. "I was 17 when I came north," he said, his rapt face turned toward the flame. 17 and stupid and convinced I was destined for greatness. My father was a shopkeeper in Seattle, a small man with small dreams, and I despised him for his lack of ambition. When I heard about the gold strikes in Alaska, I stole $500 from his safe and bought passage on the first ship north." Margaret listened, feeling an unwelcome sympathy for the young young man he'd been. Ambitious, hungry, desperate to prove himself. Not so different from thousands of others who'd come north seeking fortune. The first 5 years were hard. I worked claims that didn't pay, spent winters half-starving, nearly died twice from exposure, and once from a knife fight over a disputed boundary. But I learned how to read the land, how to find gold where others missed it, how to work harder and smarter than the competition. His voice took on a bitter edge. I also learned that in Alaska, the law was whatever you could enforce yourself. That claim jumpers weren't punished unless you punished them personally, that the strong took what they wanted and the weak accepted it or died. That doesn't justify what you did, Rose said quietly. She'd been listening from the edge of the circle, her young face troubled. No, it doesn't, Thornhill agreed. I'm not asking for justification, just trying to explain how a stupid, ambitious boy became a monster, how small compromises led to bigger ones, how easy it is to stop seeing people as people and start seeing them as costs on a ledger. He told them about finding the Golden Promise mine in 1898, about the incredible wealth it produced in the early years, about building the mansion to prove he'd succeeded beyond his father's wildest dream. I thought if I built something grand enough, made enough money, became important enough, I'd finally feel like I'd proven my worth. But the more I had, the more I feared losing, and that fear made me do terrible things. The death of his first miner, a man named O'Brien who died in a cave-in that could have been prevented with better timber supports, had haunted him for months. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, kept seeing his face, hearing his widow's screams when they told. But my business partners said these things happen in mining, that it was tragic but not our fault, that we couldn't let sentiment interfere with operations. So you listened to them, Margaret said. I listened to them, and when the next man died, it was a little easier to accept, and the next one easier still. By the time your husband died, Mrs. Fletcher, I wasn't even there. I'd been dead 6 years by then, but the system I built kept killing just fine without. The room was silent except for the fire's crackle and the gradually diminishing wind outside. Why are you telling us this? Reeves asked finally. Because you need to understand what you're fighting. It's not just Northern Star Mining or a few corrupt executives. It's a system that treats human lives as acceptable costs of doing business. A system I helped create and that outlived me. Thornhill stood, his movement slow, painful. And because when you destroy that system, and I believe you will, I want you to remember that it was built by people who made choices, people who could have chosen differently. He moved toward the stairs. The storm will break tomorrow morning. By afternoon, the sun will be out and the temperature will rise enough to make travel possible. You'll need to move quickly once you leave. Word of what you found here will spread, and there are people who will do anything to keep those documents from becoming public. We can handle it, Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. I hope so, for all our sakes. Thornhill paused on the bottom step. Mrs. Fletcher, before you go, I need to ask you something. When this is over, when you've done what you came to do, will you tell people the truth about me? Not the ghost story, not the legend, the truth. That I was just a man who made terrible choices and spent eternity paying for them. Margaret thought about this, about legacy and truth in the stories people tell. I'll tell them you helped us in the end, that you gave us the key to justice. Whether that redeems you or not, I'll let others decide. Fair enough. Thornhill climbed the stairs and disappeared into the darkness above. The storm broke just before dawn, the wind dying as suddenly as if someone had closed a door. Margaret woke to silence, real silence, without the constant howl that had been the soundtrack of their imprisonment. She went to a window on the second floor and looked out at a transformed world. Snow everywhere. The valley was gone, buried under white that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Only the tops of the tallest trees were visible, and the road, if it could still be called that, was completely obliterated. It would take days, maybe weeks, for normal travel to resume. But Reeves had found snowshoes in the mansion's storage rooms, old but serviceable. They'd be able to walk out, taking turns carrying the younger children. It would be exhausting, but possible. They spent the morning preparing for departure. Margaret selected the most valuable documents, the ones that would be hardest for the mining companies to explain away, and packed them carefully in waterproof cases they'd found in the vault. Reeves took photographs of everything else, using an old camera from Thornhill's office, creating backup evidence in case the originals were lost or destroyed. The gold presented a problem. There was too much to carry, 200 pounds, Thornhill had estimated. Even distributing it among the adults and Rose, they couldn't take more than a fraction. Take what you can carry comfortably, Reeves advised. We'll come back for the rest once we've secured the documents and gotten your family to safety. The gold isn't going anywhere. Margaret selected 4 bars, about 40 pounds total, and wrapped them carefully in cloth before distributing them into packs. At current prices, that was enough to keep her family fed and housed for years. The rest could wait. They left the mansion at noon when the sun was highest and the temperature had risen to an almost tolerable 20 below zero. Margaret took one last look at the grand hall, at the fireplace that had kept them alive, at the vault that had given them hope. Thornhill stood in the doorway, watching them prepare to leave. He'd removed his face wrappings for this final goodbye, and Margaret forced herself to look at him without flinching, to see the man beneath the monster, the prisoner beneath the ghost. Thank you, she said simply. Use it well. Make it count. His ruined voice held something that might have been hope. And Mrs. Fletcher, tell your children that some prisons are built by our own choice. Tell them to choose better than I did. I will. Well, the journey down the mountain was brutal but manageable. The snowshoes kept them from sinking into the deep drifts, and they moved in single file with Reeves breaking trail and Margaret bringing up the rear, making sure no one fell behind. The younger children rode in makeshift sleds fashioned from sheets and branches, pulled by Rose and the older boy. It took 6 hours to cover what should have been a 2-hour journey. But when they finally saw the valley settlement emerging from the white, saw smoke rising from chimneys and people digging out from the storm, Margaret felt something in her chest release. They'd made it. They'd survived. Henrik spotted them first and came running through the snow with surprising speed for an old man. "Margaret, saints preserve us! You're alive! We thought you were gone for sure." "We found shelter," Margaret said, too exhausted to explain more. "Is everyone here all right?" "Lost old Peterson and the Miller baby. God rest them. Few cases of frostbite, but most of us made it through." He looked at her children, at their healthy color and full cheeks, with obvious surprise. "You all look, well, better than well. We were lucky," Margaret said, meeting his eyes meaningfully. "Very lucky." Over the next weeks, as the valley dug out from under the historic snowfall, Margaret began to implement the plans she and Reeves had crafted. They made copies of the documents and distributed them to multiple locations: a lawyer in Fairbanks, a newspaper editor in Anchorage, a federal marshal in Juneau, insurance against any single copy being destroyed or stolen. Then they went public. The newspaper stories hit like a bomb. Widow exposes decades of mining company negligence. Secret documents prove corporate manslaughter. 17 deaths, zero accountability. Inside Alaska's deadliest mine. The mining company's response was swift and brutal. They denied everything, called Margaret a liar and fraud, suggested the documents were forgery. Northern Star Mining offered her a settlement, $50,000 and a confidentiality agreement. Margaret turned it down in a public letter published in every newspaper in the territory. The legal battle that followed lasted 2 years. 2 years of court dates and depositions and lawyers trying to intimidate a widow who refused to be intimidated. 2 years of mining company executives claiming they'd never seen the reports, never signed the memo, never made the decisions that killed 17 men. But the paper trail was too clear, the signatures too well documented, the pattern too obvious to deny. In the end, 3 executives went to prison for negligent homicide. Northern Star Mining was fined heavily and forced to implement comprehensive safety reforms. Other mining companies, seeing the writing on the wall, voluntarily improved their own practices to avoid similar prosecution. It wasn't perfect justice. The prison sentences were too short, the fines too small, and no amount of money or reform could bring back the dead. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was change. The families of the 17 dead men received compensation, not from Margaret's stolen gold, but from the mining companies themselves, forced by a court order to pay for their crime. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was more than they'd had before. Margaret used Thornhill's gold carefully, quietly. She funded a school in the valley, a real school with real teachers and books for every child. She helped widows start businesses, paid for medical care when people couldn't afford it, bought equipment for families trying to establish new claims far from the control of the big company. She never told anyone where the money came from. Let them think she'd gotten a massive settlement from Northern Star or that she'd inherited wealth from a distant relative. The truth about the vault, about Thornhill's treasure, remained a secret shared only by those who'd been there that week in January 1952. Jacob Reeves disappeared 6 months after the trial ended. Margaret received a letter from Mexico, unsigned, but in handwriting she recognized. Justice was served. Time for me to rest. Thank you for helping me finish what I started. She never heard from him again. Rose grew up to become a lawyer, inspired by the legal battle she'd witnessed. She specialized in workers' rights and spent her career fighting for the people who had no one else to fight for them. Samuel became a mine safety inspector, the youngest ever appointed in Alaska, determined to prevent other children from losing their fathers the way he'd lost his. The other children thrived too, each in their own way, building lives that their father would have been proud of. Margaret lived to see all of them married, to hold 19 grandchildren, to watch the valley transform from a desperate mining camp into a proper town with schools and hospitals and hope for the future. She never went back to Thornhill Mansion. Others did, eventually, treasure hunters and curiosity seekers and historians documenting Alaska's past. They found empty rooms and dusty furniture and a steel door standing open in the basement. The vault beyond stripped bare, but they never found Thornhill. After that winter, the sightings stopped. The creaking footsteps went silent. The wrapped figure that had haunted the mansion for 22 years simply vanished, as if finishing his final act of redemption had finally freed him from whatever bound him to that place. Some said he was finally at peace. Others said he'd never been there at all, that the whole thing had been a story made up by a desperate widow to explain the treasure she'd found. Margaret didn't care what they said. She knew the truth. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled through the valley the way it had howled around the mansion during that terrible storm, she would think about Clayton Thornhill and wonder if somewhere, somehow, he'd found the forgiveness he'd spent eternity seeking. 20 years after that winter, Margaret Fletcher stood on the porch of her comfortable house, not a mansion, but solid and warm, filled with love, and looked toward the ridge where Thornhill's monument to greed and pride still stood. They'd wanted to tear it down, the town council, but Margaret had argued against it. Let it stand, she'd said. Let it remind us. Let it teach the next generation that wealth without conscience is just another form of poverty. And so it remained, a dark shape against the sky, empty and silent, but somehow still important. A reporter came that day, a young woman from Seattle writing a feature story about the famous trial and the widow who'd taken on the mining industry and won. What would you say to other people in your situation? The reporter asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Other families who've lost someone to corporate negligence? Other people who feel powerless against the system? Margaret thought about that terrible week in January 1952, about choosing between safety and survival, about breaking into forbidden places and making deals with ghosts, about the moment she decided to fight rather than accept defeat. I tell them that the system protects the powerful, but only as long as we let it, she said finally. That sometimes the law needs help from people brave enough to demand justice instead of waiting for it to be given. That nothing changes unless someone forces it change. And if the law won't help, if the courts side with the corporations, Margaret smiled, thinking of gold bars hidden in a basement, of documents that toppled empire, of a dead man who chose redemption over eternal damnation. Then you find another way, because the fight is worth it. Your children are worth it. Justice is worth it. The reporter scribbled frantic. Can you tell me more about that week in the mansion? About how you really found the evidence? People say a lot of things, Margaret interrupted gently. Most of them aren't true. What's true is that 7 children survived a killer storm because their mother refused to give up. What's true is that 17 families finally got acknowledgement of their loss because someone cared enough to fight for them. The rest is just detail. But the gold, there's always gold, Margaret said. Real gold is my children eating breakfast every morning. Real gold is other families not having to suffer what we suffer. The rest is just shiny metal. After the reporter left, Margaret sat on her porch and watched the sun set behind the mountain. Rose came out to join her, now a young woman with her own law practice, still fighting battles for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Mom, I got word today. They're closing the last of the old Thornhill claim, converting them to strictly regulated operations with safety protocols that meet federal standards. Your lawsuit set the precedent that made it happen. Margaret nodded, satisfied. Your father would be proud of you, of all of you. He'd be proud of you too. You changed everything, Mom. We changed everything, Margaret corrected. All of us together. That's the only way real change happened. As darkness fell over the valley, lights began to glow in windows. Warm, safe lights in homes where families gathered for dinner, where children did homework, where people lived lives free from the fear that had defined Margaret's early motherhood. Somewhere on the ridge, Thornhill Mansion stood dark and empty, but Margaret liked to think that even in its abandonment, it served a purpose, a reminder, a warning, a testament to the price of greed and the possibility of redemption. And if sometimes on the coldest nights, travelers passing by the old mansion reported seeing a light in the attic window, Margaret just smiled and said nothing. Some mysteries didn't need solved. Some ghosts earned their rest. What mattered was that the living kept fighting, kept demanding better, kept refusing to accept that the world had to be the way it was. That was Thomas's legacy. That was her gift to her children. That was the treasure she'd found in the darkness of a basement vault and carried with her forever. Not gold, justice, and the knowledge that sometimes the most haunted places hold the keys to freedom. Margaret Fletcher lived to be 87 years old. She died peacefully, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never knew hunger, never knew fear, never had to choose between survival and dignity. At her funeral, they didn't talk about the trial or the mansion or the treasure. They talked about a woman who had faced a storm and refused to let it break her, who'd walked into darkness to save her children, who taught them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to fight anyway. And in Thornhill Mansion, now truly abandoned and silent, the vault door stood open, empty, its treasures spent on something more valuable than any amount of gold could ever be: hope.